Jeffrey Nall is an engaged citizen, father, and professor. He teaches philosophy and humanities at Indian River State College and the University of Central Florida. He also teaches courses in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Florida Atlantic University. He returns to us today to talk about the meaning and the significance of critical thinking beyond the buzzwords. Dr. Nall, welcome.
The concept of critical thinking is birthed by the insight that living well, being a good person, being happy, living to our fullest potential requires good thinking. What's more, good thinking is an art that requires study, practice, and conscious effort to master. Just as we should not expect to naturally develop the ability to be a pilot or be a medical physician, we should not expect to master the art of thinking without concentrated dedication and effort. The problem, of course, is that thinking is natural or normal to us in a way that flying a plane or conducting surgery isn't. So it seems strange to even suggest that thinking is an art at all. The confusion is this: anyone can think, just as anyone could theoretically, but not advisably, wield a scalpel or press buttons in the cockpit of an airplane. But it takes skill, it takes practice to think well, just as it takes skill and practice to fly a plane well and wield that scalpel properly. The end of this semester in spring and late April will mark my 10-year anniversary teaching college courses. Through this deeply satisfying, though also poorly compensated work, since I've been an adjunct most of the time, not complaining, I've taught over 120 courses in philosophy, the humanities, women, gender, and sexuality studies. I've taught courses ranging from Introduction to Ethics at Indian River State College. I've taught Encountering the Humanities at UCF. I've taught courses like Sex, Violence in Hollywood, which I'm teaching this term at Florida Atlantic University. And it's as interesting as it sounds. So if you want to make it down to Boca, sign up quickly. Classes start on Wednesday. But the class I've taught more than any other, the class that also was the most intimidating to teach at the beginning, was critical thinking. And today I'd like to share some of what I have learned over the past 10 years of dedicated study, practice, and teaching about the art of critical thinking. And I just want to be very clear, I am not standing before you as someone claiming to be a master of this art. Rather, what I claim is to be a dedicated student striving for excellence who hopes that he may have some interesting insights that you might find useful. Critical thinking is not just thinking hard or thinking a lot. To be a critical thinker is not the same as being smart or having an advanced degree. Critical thinking is no more specific to being a doctor than it is to being a mechanic or a parent. And critical thinking is as important to loving others, being a good person, and experiencing happiness as it is to getting, keeping, and performing well at a job. To sum up now what I'll spend my time describing in some greater detail, to think critically is to take responsibility for one's thinking and therefore life by determining what is true through concentrated reflection, research, and reasoning. More specifically, reflection and reasoning guided by, yes, logic, but also by creativity, humility, honesty, open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, and something I'll focus on today, courage. Thinking is something that we do all the time. To think, to navigate or make sense of or organize our experiences and our ideas is essential to being human. Thinking is so ordinary that, ironically, we often don't think about our thinking. Now, anyone who's ever gotten in a car to drive somewhere only to become entirely absorbed in music an audiobook, makeup you shouldn't have been applying, food you probably shouldn't be eating, maybe a phone call, maybe just your own thoughts, may recall that strange feeling of arriving to your destination and wondering, how the hell did I get here? Like, when did that happen? It's almost as if we'd forgotten we were operating a motor vehicle. We had just a few minutes ago been traveling at speeds surpassing 45 miles an hour, and frankly, who's going 45 miles an hour, in densely trafficked streets. We were undoubtedly thinking as we were shifting gears, using turn signals. Some of us. Turning the wheel to maneuver around a corner, accelerating, or applying the brake. The point is, thinking is so natural to our lives that one of the challenges we face, I would say maybe the most important challenge we face as human beings, is to develop a mindfulness, a basic self-awareness of the very thinking that quite literally drives us through life. Too often we falsely believe we're simply experiencing the world exactly as it is, with a kind of, a naked eye, without adulteration, without influence, without ideology. And here we discover one of the most significant obstacles to critical thinking, our tendency to be oblivious, not always intentionally though, but to be oblivious to the multiplicity of divergent thought, belief, and also experience outside of our own minds, such that we take our own views as self-evidently true, and we're shocked, we're surprised, we're dismayed that others don't see it as we do. One of the most important steps in pursuing the art of thinking well is becoming mindful that your beliefs are the result of an often unrecognized interpretive process of reasoning or making inferences. This is not exactly the most exciting part of my talk. But it is, I really think, the most important part. The importance of mindful thinking can't be overstated once you grasp the significance of the fact that most of what we claim to know about the world is a result not of a direct experience or mere observation, but of a perpetual process of interpretation through inference or reasoning. To infer or reason is to come to a conclusion about something. I'm going to like that movie, for example, on the basis of something else that we think is true. I like movies with Tom Cruise. That movie has Tom Cruise in it. Therefore, I'll like that movie. Now, while most of us well know the dictionary definition of inference and reasoning, we use these words so regularly that therein lie the problem. It's the familiarity that is often best hidden from us. We have a tendency to confuse knowing how to generally, for example, use a word or knowing its basic definition with understanding its elemental meaning and its deeper implications. Very few things, if any, in life can be understood without inference, without interpretation. And when we consider how often we draw conclusions on a daily basis and how those inferences, those interpretations, form the basis of subsequent inferences and interpretations, we're in a position to appreciate how important it is for us to develop a mindfulness about that thought process that is shaping our thoughts. And because it shapes our thoughts, it shapes our actions. And then it shapes our lives by shaping our understanding. I begin my critical thinking courses trying to help students appreciate the significance that human beings make sense out of the world, not merely by observing that, for example, the four-legged furry creature barking and wagging its tail is a dog, but that the conclusion that this is a dog is the result of an inference, of our having filtered our observation of this four-legged furry creature barking and wagging its tail through a concepts by and large which come from our culture, come from our society, passed down by our families, that if something has four legs and barks, then it's a dog. The problem we face is that we believe our perception of and thinking about the world is unfiltered, that we simply see the world as it is, and we're frustrated that all of these other people, these damn fools, can't see what anyone with 20/20 vision should be able to see. Imagine the following. You are telling your friend about your recent argument with your spouse. Your friend keeps checking her watch. And you conclude that they clearly don't care about your feelings or difficulties. So you cut off the conversation and leave abruptly. Now, first of all, I'd like to imagine that a scenario like this is just too immature to resonate with anyone in this room. But again, if you're human, I'm assuming that we're not quite as rational as we'd like to think we are. But here's the thing. It feels that way. It feels disrespectful. Later, when your friend calls asking what the heck happened, you indignantly respond with a condemnation of their behavior. You are so insensitive. You're so disrespectful. And the situation, of course, spirals downward from there as your friend angrily defends herself against what she perceives as an unprovoked attack. We too infrequently appreciate that the facts of the world do not by themselves disclose their meaning or their significance. To determine something's meaning or significance, we filter it through one or more related interpretive beliefs. The fact our friend is checking the time could indicate impatience or disinterest or inconsideration, or it could mean that they have a place to be and they can't be late. The fact that our friend sits and listens to us, checking the time periodically, might indicate that they've chosen to stay in our company up until the very last minute when they know they need to get out of there so they can make it to where they need to go. The point is that the fact that someone is looking at the time doesn't tell us anything other than they're looking at the time. Only when such a fact is coupled with an interpretive belief, such as if they check their time frequently, they don't care what we have to say, and so on. That is an assumption that we make it. It's an interpretation that shapes our consciousness. Once we understand our profoundly unique, creative, but also burdensome condition as thinking and interpretive beings, we are faced with how best to go about deciding how to make sense of what William James called this blooming, buzzing confusion of life. There's all this information, but what do we do with it? How do we make sense of it? Thinking rationally means taking responsibility to justify ourselves, explaining how or why we embraced a conclusion. It's unfortunate that in a society so focused on the notion of self-reliance, we've forgotten what that Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson meant by the concept when he wrote an essay of the same name. Ralph Waldo Emerson was less interested in economic self-reliance, but intellectual self-reliance. Do we do our own thinking? Do we stand on our own two intellectual feet? More than just explaining how or why rational thinking further requires us to explain why the reasons we give are actually good or worth relying on for our conclusion or our belief. In other words, not just any reason will do to think critically, but a good reason is what we're after. To think critically is to think in a coherent or a consistent manner. Our statements of belief should be logically possible, which is to say that they should at least be imaginably true. This seems like a real low standard, actually. The sad thing is, the reality is that it's actually much higher than it seems. It's actually difficult for us to reach this standard. When our statements of belief entail some kind of a fundamental logical contradiction, they're logically impossible. They're false. Despite claims to the contrary, some things are actually impossible. It's logically impossible for me to be in Florida right now, but also be in Texas. It's impossible for LeBron James to be better or worse than himself in basketball. For Bill Bladsky to have killed Eric Reed, though Eric Reed does not exist. And for you to live in a democracy wherein the public exercises no decision-making power in choosing elected leaders. Each of these are literal absurdities, meaning that they violate the basic law of non-contradiction, something we can all agree on, even during a time of social and political polarization. It's the principle dictating that contradictory statements, you're up but you're down, you're in but you're out, it's good and it's bad, are necessarily false. They're literally illogical. They are absurd. The point here is that our beliefs carry the weight of logical implications that must be accounted for when we think and we communicate. We can't just have it exactly as we wish to. If existence is necessary for doing anything in the world, then the moment we knew Eric Rice has never existed, we know that he has never killed anyone. And since democracy is an idea that means the right of the public to exercise decision-making power and choosing elected leaders, to speak of a society where the public doesn't have that ability is obviously not to speak of a flawed democracy, it's just not to speak of democracy. To be counted as reasonable, which is not an easy thing to achieve, we have to strive at a bare minimum to ensure that the beliefs, the statements, the assertions we make about the world at least get along with the other beliefs that we assert in the world. To think critically, we must acknowledge and we have to resolve contradictions. If it's true, as our president once claimed, that if Barack Obama won the presidency through the Electoral College and not the popular vote, that he would be a fraudulent president, then it should also be true that when President Trump won in precisely that manner in 2016, losing the popular vote by more than 1 million votes, then his victory was fraudulent by his own logic, not by mine, not by some externally imposed vision. And of course, I think some of you know that Obama won the popular vote against Mitt Romney. If it's true, though, if you think I'm picking on the president, if it's true that President Trump's escalation with Iran is unconstitutional because he initiated an act of war without congressional approval, despite the absence of an imminent threat to our national security, as Mike Lee, a Republican, and Rand Paul, another Republican, said it was not, then we should equally condemn President Obama's military actions, counseled by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that led the United States to not only engage in a conflict, but to topple the entire government of Libya without congressional permission and without the threat of an imminent attack on the United States of America. The point is not to shame or silence this person or that person upon locating a logical contradiction, but rather to highlight them so that we can thoughtfully and honestly resolve them in a fair-minded manner. In contrast to the celebration of one-liner witticisms and social media mic drops, critical thinking invites us to pass the mic of critique, have an actual conversation. This is what I think. What do you say? This is my response to you. What is your response? Critical thinking's demand for reasonable thinking is a demand for principled thinking, something Henry David Thoreau had something to say about. And principled thinking is important to us. Why? Because only by consistently aligning and being true to the beliefs we say we hold dear can we achieve the coveted integrity that makes a good life possible. The pursuit of integrity through confronting contradictions requires more than skillful deployment of reasoning. Resolving our intellectual and moral inconsistency, our lack of integrity, and all of us lack perfect integrity. It requires character. It requires something mentioning earlier in the service. It requires courage. The contemporary philosopher Cornel West poetically paraphrases William Butler Yeats as having written, "It takes more courage for a person to search the dark corners of their own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Courage to think critically. Courage," he says, "is the enabling virtue of any person." And here West echoes the wisdom offered by an existentialist psychologist by the name of Rollo May, who wrote that life itself calls for us to, quote, confront a no man's land, to push into a forest where there are no well-worn paths and from which no one has returned to guide us. We are called to live into the future, which means leaping into the unknown, and this requires a degree of courage for which there is no immediate precedent and which few people realize. May contends that courage, quote, is that foundation that underlies and gives reality to all other virtues and personal values. To think critically is not just to have the command of reason and logic and the facts. To think critically is to courageously encounter questions and answers that may justifiably frighten us precisely because the answers may leave us changed. Courageously thinking, for example, refuses to embrace dishonest conclusions simply because they're socially safer. Rather, the aim is, as the British philosopher John Stuart Mill instructed, to follow good faith reasoning wherever it leads us. Critical thinking demands that we not only learn the many different kinds of fallacies or errors of reasoning that people commit, but that we daringly search for them in our own thinking, first and foremost, in ourselves, and that once we identify them, we seek to extricate them from our lives. The list of fallacies is really long, and so once we begin to replace intellectual arrogance with humility, we soon realize, and to me this is maybe one of the more important points, it's so much easier to be wrong than it is to be right. And so one fallacy I'd like to bring to your attention as I finish here is a fallacy that I think everyone in this room commits, probably with regularity and maybe with a presumption that it's correct. This is the fallacy of the appeal to moderation. The notion that whatever belief stands between two seemingly extreme positions must be the true position. This is a fallacy or error of reasoning that many people across political, ideological, spiritual, cultural boundaries practice. And in recognizing this error in ourselves, we can begin to nourish the humility and perhaps also the courage that in turn enlivens critical thinking within us. You can see the error of the appeal to moderation. Now, moderation in itself, you say, I want to be moderate. I want to choose the moderate position. It has an air of positivity, of compromise, which we think is a good thing, and usually, very often, in many circumstances, it can be. But to see the error of presuming that which is the middle road is always the best, just consider an example. I think Eric is 20. Eric, who's walking around with a birth certificate, says that he's 40. I think the guy just looks way too young to be 40. I'm pretty sure the birth certificate's wrong. Now, at some point, some onlooker is getting irritated with us disrupting his latte at Starbucks, leans in and says, let's just say Eric is 30 and be done with it, okay? I mean, it's like right in the middle there. Accepting the compromise position might temporarily resolve the dispute, but the fact would remain that Eric is 40, and we will have betrayed the truth with a superficial compromise. To give a more important and weighty example, I'll ask you to think for yourself what the moderate position was between the Civil War era fire eaters, like William Porcher Miles, creator of the battle flag of the Confederacy, who argued that we should not only maintain the enslavement of African people, but we should also embrace the exportation of slavery to grow the status and wealth of our nation. And on the other hand, the other extreme, revolutionary Christian John Brown, who took up arms at the financing of figures like Harriet Tubman to achieve abolition of slavery. Two extremes. What's the middle there? Maybe a nice, comfortable segregation. As we approach the celebration of 100 years of suffrage for women's right to vote, what would the moderate position have been between the demands of the suffragists, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, and the large majorities who insisted women had no right to vote, no right to govern, and a whole lot of no rights also to be added? If you sit here today as a supporter of the abolition of slavery, of the enfranchisement of women, you are evidence of the absurdity of the appeal to moderation. You are, like me also, benefactors of the moral and intellectual courage of our forefathers and foremothers who were willing to take up the extreme position when it had truth on its side. And so I'd like to leave you with, I think apropos, given we're on the cusp of Martin Luther King Day, with words from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. eloquently criticized the irrational confidence and the moderate so-called view. 10 days before the man was murdered, March 25, 1968, he appeared at the 68th Annual Convention of the Rabbinical Assembly and responded to some questions. He was asked if he was a moderate, and King offered this incisive articulation of two different visions of moderation, calling one a vice and one a virtue. He said, if by moderation we mean moving on through this tense period of transition, cultural, social transition, with wide restraint, calm reasonableness, yet militant action, then moderation is a great virtue, which all leaders should seek to achieve. But if moderation means slowing up in the move for justice, capitulating to the whims and caprices of the guardians of the deadening status quo, then moderation is a tragic vice which all good men will condemn. End quote. While King today is exalted by self-described moderates who use his ideas to further their endorsement of today's deadening status quo, King clearly disavowed the form of moderation advocated by many today. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he embraced the epithet of extremist. He said, was Jesus not an extremist in love? Quote, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Is it not an extremist statement to say that I love General Soleimani, the Iranian general? Is it, if he's an enemy and we are to love our enemies, is it not an extremist idea that we should love precisely those the least deserving of love? King says, was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, end quote. So the question, King writes, is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the prevention of justice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? So on the eve of the 2020 Martin Luther King Day, I invite you to appreciate the critical thinking, or rather the critical thinker joins Reverend Dr. King in exemplifying the courage to choose so-called extremism whenever that extremism is endorsed by reasoned, ethical judgment, when the so-called extreme position is the only path to preserve one's commitment to truth and so also one's integrity. Critical thinking demands courage. The question is whether or not we have that courage. Thank you.